that the Quran is analogous to the Christian Bible, a single chronologically ordered book written by various authors over centuries. How do you distinguish the Quran from such a comparison, and what are the key differences in its compilation and claimed origin?
So I think it is easy to see the difference between Quran and Bible. One just needs to read between them. Um, the Bible, or in fact, let's be more accurate, the Gospels, that is the core of the Bible, is basically mostly the story of Jesus. And of course, in that story, we also read some advice, some the lectures, the talks, the speeches of Jesus as well. But basically, it's just the story of Jesus, and the story that is being given to us by an observer. Okay, one of the apostles. The Quran is not a book of story. So you start reading from the beginning. No, it's not a book of story. Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. It's talk about the Quran and itself. So the first thing is that Bible is book of story. Okay. Let me reword that. Not that Bible is book of story. I also believe that even Bible is for zikr, and it is for purification. But when you read the Bible, you read stories. Okay, when you read the Quran, it's not stories. That's one thing. The other thing is that the language, as I talked about it before. So even if you look at the original Aramic language of Bible, I don't think even the Christians would say that it is as beautiful as the Arabic language of the Quran. The Quran intentionally has been made beautiful. This is very important. That's why you see there's rhyme at the end of the verses. Okay, and it is interesting. For instance, let me tell you this: that Surah إِنَّا أَنزَلْنَاهُ فِي لَيْلَةِ الْقَدْرِ وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ لَيْلَةُ الْقَدْرِ خَيْرٌ مِّنْ أَلْفِ شَهْرٍ تَنَزَّلُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَالرُّوحُ فِيهَا بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِم مِّن كُلِّ أَمْرٍ سَلَامٌ هِيَ حَتَّى مَطْلَعِ الْفَجْرِ. Okay, so all the endings are like with Ra, okay, Qadr, Shahr, and all that. There's a question among the scholars of the Quran that the verse that says Laylatul Qadr khayrun min alf shahr, which means the night of Qadr, the night of value, is better than 1,000 months. Okay, there's a question that you will not compare apples with oranges. You will not compare centimeters with inches, right? Or centimeters with meters. White is comparing one night with 1,000 months instead of saying 1,000 nights. Okay? And there are lots of discussions about it, what the reasons are. You might be interested to know that one of the explanations coming from Muslim scholars is that it's because of that rhyming at the end, shahr, because it rhymes nice with Badr. And this is the importance of beauty of the Quran. Okay, so I don't think Bible has that beauty even in its original language. The other thing that I think is very much different between Quran and Bible is that I need to make this footnote here that I'm not talking about which one is better than which one. I'm not saying that. I think each one of them has their own qualities. We're just talking about the differences. So another difference is that, as I said, God exists in the Quran. When you read the Quran, you see God in front of you. More than just thinking that, oh, this reminds me and says there is a God. No. The language of the Quran, I mean, he's directly talking to you. Okay, so again, I don't think we can argue that Injil is the same. In terms of originality and authenticity, I talked about it before, and let's skip that historical aspect because we don't want to talk about Christianity versus Islam or anything like that. Of course, there are four Gospels, and these are according to four apostates of Jesus as being reported, and we do know that. As far as I know, none of them have been directly received from those apostates, but it was attributed to them. But at the same time, I should also say that the Quran refers to Injil and Torah, and the Quran says to followers of Injil, فَلْيَحْكُمْ أَهْلَ الْإِنْجِيلَ بِمَا they need to follow the Injil, they need to follow rulings of Injil and all that. And same for Torah. And the Injil and Torah that was at the time of the Prophet Muhammad was pretty much the same Injil and Torah that we have today. The meaning of that is that when the Quran says, look at these books, you will find that these things are also in those books. It was talking about the same books that we have today as Injil and Torah. So Quran has given them credit. That may not necessarily mean that they are 100% authentic, but the Quran has given them that credit.
Right. And just to clarify, there are stories obviously mentioned in the Quran as well. But do you think that maybe just in terms of numbers, they're less?
Yes, because it's not about number. It's just that when you read Bible, and I'm talking Gospels in particular, because Bible has different parts, of course, but I'm talking about Gospels, which is the core Bible that we have. It is basically a story. So it starts and ends. It's a one story. It's a story, and a very beautiful story, of course, very beautiful story, with lots of things to take from it. Quran is not a story from beginning to the end. You read it, and as appropriate for that zikr that I talked about, it gives you some stories here and there.
Right. Okay, perfect.
Okay?
Now, this is a tricky question. Another area of frequent misunderstanding between different schools in Islam, it revolves around the idea of interpretation. Some see the Quran as a text with a single, unchangeable meaning, while others argue for a more dynamic and evolving understanding. Dr. Shafti, from your perspective, what's the role of human interpretation in engaging with the Quran? And what are the pitfalls of both overly rigid and overly liberal approaches?
The first thing would be that, so let's talk about the rigid part. The first thing is we need to be open-minded when we read the verses of the Quran and when we read different interpretations about the verses of the Quran. As you can see from my white beard, so I'm not that young anymore, but I can easily remember when I was much younger, I had read, for instance, one particular interpretation of a verse of the Quran, and in my very young and inexperienced mind, I was thinking, this is it. This is the only interpretation. There is no interpretation. It cannot be anything else. This is it, right? And then a few years later, I would hear a totally different interpretation. And then as a young person, I would resist. I would say, no, it's impossible. How can you say that? But then time passes, I read more and I read more and I study more, and then suddenly I realize, no, actually, that second interpretation makes more sense. The first interpretation was actually very stupid. Yeah? So what I learned from there was that when we hear, and this is not just about interpretation of the Quran, it's about hearing anything, any concepts, any new ideas. Often we open these two columns in our mind, accepting it or rejecting it. And we want to immediately put it in one of these columns, accept, reject, accept, reject. I think it will be much wiser if we have a third column. And the third column would be something like something to consider later. Okay? We don't need to decide about everything just now. We don't need to decide whether I agree with this or I disagree with this. No. We can put something in the third column as well. Okay, that's interesting. Let me think about it. For instance, the verse that I said, Surah Al-Qadr, Laylatul Qadr khayrun min alf shahr. I am sure that for many audience, what I said, which is not my view, I didn't say that, although I think I very much agree with that, but it hasn't come from me. This is coming from other scholars, that the only reason we have shahr here is because of the rhyming at the end of the verse. I'm sure for many people, they will, no, it cannot be. This cannot be. How can the Quran be something like that? I would say, well, put it in the third column. Don't put it in the second column, rejection. Put it in the third column. So the first thing, and as I said, we will talk about interpretation of the Quran and the things we need to consider in more detail later. But for now, the first thing I would say is that just making sure that we have open mind when we look at the verses of the Quran, and when we read different interpretations, let's make sure that we have open mind. The second thing would be on the other side of the spectrum, as you said, being too liberal. Yeah, just appreciating the fact that although a verse can have hierarchical meanings, so a surface meaning and then much more in-depth meaning, yeah, but these hierarchical meanings are each at the top of the other ones. None of them are contradicting with each other. None of them are even different from each other. Okay, so for instance, قد أفلح من زكاها, and I say it means that the one who reaches spiritual purification or does spiritual purification will reach success. Then this is it, right? But someone might look at this much deeper than that, yeah, and bring out much in-depth meaning out of it. So that's fine, that's possible, yeah. But for instance, we cannot say that, okay, zakah here means, for instance, three different things at the same time. So it means spiritual purification. At the same time, it means having good money. At the same time, it means being beautiful. No, it has to be one of these. So the meanings cannot be horizontal. The meanings needs to be vertical. So surface meaning, in-depth meaning, rather than this and this and that. That is something to consider. And then by considering it, I think the most important thing we need to appreciate and understand is that we need to try to reduce contradictions in understanding the Quran as much as we can. Okay? Of course, if you are a non-Muslim and if you believe that this is not coming from the Almighty, then you will be keen to find contradictions. And people in their own thinking find contradictions, right? But if you believe that this is coming from God, and if you look at it from that perspective, you would expect that there should not be any contradictions in it. The Quran itself says that there is no contradiction in this. I'm going to say something, and I totally understand if the audience say, well, you say that because you're a Muslim. But I think even as a non-Muslim, if somebody looks at the Quran and understands the narrative of the Quran, they will not see any contradiction, right? But what I'm trying to say, again, related to your question, Irtiqa, is that in interpreting the verses of the Quran, we need to make sure that we will not interpret a verse in a way that it contradicts another verse, or our interpretation of another verse. So it's like a domino effect, It's like a domino effect. You cannot just interpret this verse in this way and then just leave it there. Okay, if you're interpreting it in this way, you need to keep going. I need to make sure that other verses will not contradict with this. So for now, I think that is the overall umbrella's way of looking at it, but we will look at this in more detail, I think, in the future episodes.
Yeah, that was actually really thought-provoking. And even though you've given one example of such a verse, but just building on that, Dr. Shafti, your work has often challenged conventional understandings of certain Quranic verses, particularly when viewed through a purely modern lens. Could you give us one more example of a verse or concept in the Quran that is frequently misunderstood today, and how your historical and linguistic analysis sheds new light on what it is versus what it is not?
So So I try to give you two examples for now because you just asked me, so I'm just two things that just came to my mind. So, for instance, in the Quran, Surah An-Nahl, verse number 89, in the middle of the verse, we says that وَنَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ. We have sent this book to you, which is explanation for everything. Okay? A few years ago, I was discussing this with somebody who got in touch with email, and he was arguing that based on this verse, everything is in the Quran, every knowledge is in the Quran. In the Quran is answer for all our questions. Okay? And I asked him in reply, okay, so my aunt, she has Alzheimer. Can you tell me what she needs to do to come out of Alzheimer? Can you tell me what the Quran says? And his answer was that, okay, the Quran says you need to be patient. And I didn't reply to that. But if I wanted to reply, I would say, well, okay, but that's not the information that I'm looking for. And even Aristotle, many thousand years before the Quran says you need to be patient. So that's not the answer I'm looking for. This is one of these examples. So you look at نزلنا وَنَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ. You just read this and say, all right, Quran, everything is in the Quran. So Quran is the complete code of life. Again, the problem that we have here is that we are not looking at the whole Quran. We are not looking at the way that the Quran itself is introducing itself, right? Once we understand that the Quran is for Tazkiyah, the Quran is zikr and advice, yeah, and then what we understand from this verse is that, okay, it's tibyanan likulli shay. So it's explanation for everything, but everything relating to zikr for tazkiyah, for purification, and even that for the direct utterances of the Quran for which this verse was being revealed. Let me give you another example. Okay. So for instance, another one, verse number 7 in Surah Anbiya. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَا قَبْلَكَ إِلَّا رِجَالًا نُوحِي إِلَيْهِمْ فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. And we have not sent to you men, but the ones who they have received revelation. Okay, this is in response to the criticism that people had at the time of the Prophet, that what is this, that you need to wait for revelation? Why can't you just throw us something like this, the whole book, or why we cannot see God in front of us or something like that? So it says that all the prophets were like this. This فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Go and ask أهل الذِّكْر if you don't know about it, if you don't know this. And أهل الذِّكْر literally means people who belong to zikr. Okay, it can literally be interpreted, not literally, but it can be interpreted as people of knowledge. Okay, so this verse has been interpreted that it says that go and ask the scholars if you don't know. So the last part of the verse has been taken out. فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Yeah, and they say that this part of verse of the Quran tells you that if you don't know, you need to go and ask the scholars. Okay? Now, of course, if you don't know, we should go and ask the scholars. I'm not rejecting that, but that is not this verse is saying, because again, one of those things that we can easily misunderstand. We read a verse and we totally miss the fact that maybe this verse has been repeated other places in the Quran. And if it has been repeated other places, then maybe there is some explanation there that we can fully understand better. Okay, so the verse that I read for you was in Surah Anbiya, verse number 7. Similar expression, in fact, similar wording is in Surah Nahl, verse number 43. Again, it says, فَاسْأَلُوا أَهْلَ الذِّكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ, and the verse after says بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ وَالزُّبُرِ. So it says, go and ask Ahl al-Zikr if you don't know Bayyanat and Zubur, which is the books of the previous prophets. So then that means that Ahl al-Zikr here are actually the scholars of Ahl al-Kitab, the scholars of the people of the book. Now it makes sense, because how can a verse of the Quran addressing Quraysh, who did not believe in the Prophet, tells them go and ask scholars. Which scholars? There is no scholars there. It says go and ask the experts, the scholars of the people of the book, because they know. Okay, so they ask them that is it true that when God sent a messenger, he sends revelations to them? They will explain for you. Okay, so these are two immediate examples that come to my mind just now. Before that, sorry, another thing that I've wanted to say and I forgot before you asked me your last question. When you asked me about the Injil and the Bible and the Quran and comparison, there's another difference between the two, which is very important, and that is the Quran is a book that is aware of itself. What I mean by that is that when you read the Quran talks about the Quran. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. And the verse that says we have sent you zikr, this is shifa, this is furqan. The Quran talks about itself. The Quran is aware of itself. Okay? You don't see that in the Bible. The Bible doesn't tell you that I am this, by the way. You don't see that in the Bible.
Right.
That very much relates to that idea that God exists in the text of the Quran, as if God exists. In fact, it's interesting that, I'm not saying that, but it's interesting that I know that some of the Christians who try to explain for their other fellow Christians how we see the Quran, they say to them that if you want to understand how Muslims see the Quran, you should not think that they see the Quran the way that we see the Bible, but you can think about it this way: the way that we see Jesus, that's the way that they see the Quran. That's in a way a manifestation of the Almighty in words, in letters. Okay, your last question.
Yes. So, Dr. Shafti, you've made a compelling case for the Quran as a profoundly integrated text where individual verses often gain their full meaning only when understood within the broader tapestry of the entire revelation. Could you elaborate on this interconnectedness and perhaps offer an analogy to help our listeners grasp this holistic nature? I think that's what many people, readers of the Quran, struggle with. I think they focus on maybe like a verse or two, and unfortunately, the holistic nature of it just escapes a lot of people.
Okay, so again, I try to answer that question without being too much detail, because I know that later on a question will come in the next episodes about how to try to interpret the Quran. What I'm trying to say is that the Quran has a narrative. The whole Quran has a narrative. We need to understand that narrative. I'm not going to discuss just now what that narrative is, yeah? But the Quran has a narrative. We need to understand that narrative. And that narrative is not as simple as saying that, oh, it's a reminder for God. No. Much more specific than that. Much more technical than that. The Quran has a narrative. And that narrative will then clarify for us what the context of the Quran is. Then, normally, a group of verses that are together, normally, they themselves have a context, sub-context compared to the whole context of the Quran. They are like sub-narratives to that main narrative of the Quran, okay? So when I read a verse, I need to make sure that I understand these narratives, the contexts, okay? Again, I'm not going to say what narrative that is, but the person needs to know what this narrative is, okay? Otherwise, I'm not saying that if they don't know it, they will make a mistake, but I'm saying that if they don't know it, there is a risk, high risk, that they may make an obvious mistake, not just, coming up with a view that might be different from others, but they may make an obvious mistake if they don't do it, okay? And then the other thing, as I just showed you, is that so this context thing is like vertical thing. Okay, so you have the whole narrative of the Quran. Just imagine like this, yeah, and then you have the narrative of group of verses, yeah, and then you have the verse. Yeah, some people say there is a middle narrative there as well, and that is narrative of the chapter. So narrative of the Quran, narrative of the chapter, narrative of the group of verses. That the verse that you're interested in is placed there. You need to know these to make sure that you understand this verse correctly. That is one thing. The other, so that's a vertical connection. The other one is horizontal connection, which means that just like the example of Ahl al-Zikr that I discussed with you, you read a verse, it is always advisable to try to find whether similar verse or exact verse or similar expressions or some of the words have been repeated elsewhere in the Quran, because that can often help you to understand what the verse is trying to say. I think if we ignore these horizontal and vertical connections, again, I'm not saying that you will definitely make a mistake, but the risk of making bad mistakes is quite high. Okay, you asked me about examples and all that. Let me give you another example, but this one I don't want to provide my own understanding of it. I want to encourage you and other listeners to, maybe if they have time and if they're interested, they look it up. We will discuss this verse in the next category of our discussions when we talk about pluralism. This is the verse. Give me 1 second. Okay, so this is the verse in Surah Fath, the 48th Surah of the Quran. هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق. He's the one who sent his messenger with hidayah, with guidance, and din al-haq, the upright, the right, the true religion. لِيُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ, so that it can prevail, it can dominate all the other religions. So it can basically push out every other religion, and this becomes the one religion. لِيُظْهِرَهُ عَلَى الدِّينِ كُلِّهِ. This verse often is used by many scholars to say that ultimately what God wants and what Muslims need to think about is that the whole world needs to become Muslim, because the verse says that. So Islam needs to dominate the whole face of earth. I would argue maybe not. Maybe that's not what the verse is saying. So if you have time and if audience like it, I encourage them to look at this verse and the instances of repeating the same expression in other places in the Quran. Look at the words like deen and haq in this verse and see if it is possible to come up with a different understanding. And inshallah, I will try to explain that, my understanding about that, in one of the episodes when we talk about pluralism.
Inshallah. Well, Dr. Shafti, this has been an incredible journey through the structural and spiritual layers of the Quran. Your insights into the linguistic nuances and the historical context really challenge us to look at the text with fresh eyes. Thank you once again for your time, your intellectual honesty, and for helping us peel back the layers of what the Quran is and what it truly is not. It's always an absolute pleasure to learn from you. So thank you so much once again. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for our 5th episode. We want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the nature of the Quran? Did today's discussion challenge any of your long-held views or spark new questions? You can join our conversation. You can leave a comment below the video. We read them all and we value your perspective. You can get in touch with us if you have deeper questions or suggestions for future topics. You can email us directly at beyonddogmaseries@gmail.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning and keep seeking. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.